When we speak about people Allah has warned us about, we have to be very careful not to turn the conversation into one of arrogance or self-righteousness. This is not about us deciding who deserves mercy and who does not. It is about understanding Allah's boundaries, because boundaries are what protect the human soul. The first and most serious warning Allah gives us is about shirk, associating partners with Him, when a person dies without repentance. This is not a minor theological detail. It is the foundation upon which faith itself stands. Allah tells us clearly in the Quran that He may forgive any sin He wills, but He does not forgive shirk if a person meets Him in that state. That statement alone should make us pause. Why is this sin treated differently? Because shirk is not just an action, it is a world view. It is a rejection of ultimate truth. Philosophically, it fractures the human understanding of purpose. Psychologically, it disorients the soul, because when you place your ultimate trust, fear, hope, or love in something other than the one who created you, you will always be unstable. You are anchoring your heart to something that cannot truly hold it. Notice something important here. Allah's warning is not about people who made mistakes, had doubts, or struggled along the way. Islam is deeply compassionate toward the human journey. This warning is about someone who knowingly, consciously persists in shirk, and then dies without turning back. Repentance remains open until the very last breath. That alone tells you how merciful Allah is, but it also tells you how serious this matter is when repentance is deliberately refused. Now, from a social and ethical perspective, this teaches us restraint. We are not asked to go around condemning people or playing the role of judge. In fact, we are warned against that. What we are taught is clarity. We do not normalize shirk. We do not excuse it. We do not dilute the truth to make ourselves or others comfortable. There is a difference between being kind to people and being careless with principles. Islam never asks us to choose between the two. There is also a deeply personal lesson here. Shirk is not always statues and rituals. It can be subtle. It can be when power becomes your God, when validation becomes your God, when fear of people outweighs fear of Allah, when wealth dictates your morality. These are the quiet forms that slip into the heart unnoticed. And that is why this warning is not meant to make us point fingers outward, but to look inward with honesty. So when we say this is someone you must never forgive, what we really mean is this. You do not override Allah's truth with emotional shortcuts. Forgiveness does not mean redefining reality. Allah's mercy is vast, but it is never random. It is rooted in wisdom, truth, and accountability. And perhaps the reflection we should leave with is this. If Allah, in His infinite mercy, draws a clear line here, then the most intelligent thing we can do is not argue with the line, but make sure we never come close to crossing it ourselves. After understanding the danger of openly rejecting truth, Allah then draws our attention to something far more subtle, and in many ways far more dangerous, hypocrisy. Because hypocrisy does not attack faith from the outside, it eats it away from the inside. The Quran speaks about hypocrites with a severity that surprises many people, not because Allah is harsh, but because the damage they cause is deep, hidden, and long-lasting. A hypocrite is not someone who struggles with faith or goes through moments of weakness. That is part of being human. A hypocrite, in the Quranic sense, is someone who knows the truth, claims to be aligned with it, but actively works against it. Psychologically, this is a fractured personality. One face for the public, another for private interests. One language for believers, another for enemies of belief. Over time, this kind of inner contradiction kills sincerity, not just in the individual, but in the community around them. Allah describes hypocrites as being in the lowest depths of hell, not because they disbelieved openly, but because they weaponized trust. When someone stands outside Islam and criticizes it, the damage is limited. People recognize opposition, but when someone claims loyalty while quietly sabotaging values, institutions, and unity, the harm spreads unnoticed. It creates confusion, it erodes confidence, it makes sincere believers doubt themselves rather than the deception in front of them. Philosophically, hypocrisy is the betrayal of truth for convenience. It is choosing short-term benefit over long-term integrity, and when this becomes habitual, the person no longer even sees themselves as dishonest. They justify, they rationalize, they convince themselves that their intentions are pure, while their actions say otherwise. That is why Allah warns us so strongly, because once self-deception sets in, repentance becomes unlikely. Now, Islam does not tell us to hunt hypocrites or accuse people recklessly. In fact, we are warned against suspicion and judgment, but it does teach us discernment. Not everyone who smiles means well. Not every religious appearance reflects sincerity. Forgiving such people repeatedly without accountability does not produce mercy. It produces decay. Mercy without truth becomes negligence. There is also a personal lesson here that is uncomfortable but necessary. Hypocrisy is not always political or public. Sometimes it lives quietly within us, when our values change depending on who we are with, when we speak about Islam but don't let it correct our behavior. When faith becomes an identity rather than a discipline, the Quran's warning is not just about them. It is a mirror for us. The danger of hypocrisy is that it makes a person spiritually numb. They pray, but it doesn't transform them. They speak, but their words lack weight. They belong, but they don't build. And Allah, in His wisdom, tells us not to confuse tolerance with trust. So the reflection to walk away with is this: sincerity is not loud, but it is consistent. And the moment we start protecting appearances more than principles, we are not defending faith, we are quietly undermining it. After hypocrisy, Allah directs our attention to a category that every human heart instinctively recognizes as dangerous: persistent oppression. It is not just a moral failure in Islam, it is a structural violation of how Allah designed human relationships. And that is why the Quran repeatedly warns us that Allah does not love the oppressors, does not guide the oppressors, and does not grant success to the oppressors, especially when they persist without repentance. Oppression is not always dramatic. It is not only tanks, prisons, or public cruelty. Sometimes it is quiet, calculated, and socially acceptable. It is the abuse of power in a home, the exploitation of workers, the silencing of voices, the manipulation of systems, the emotional crushing of those who cannot defend themselves. Psychologically, oppression grows from entitlement. The oppressor begins to believe they are exempt from accountability, and the longer that belief is reinforced, the harder it becomes to admit wrongdoing. Allah's warning here is precise. He does not close the door of forgiveness to someone who oppressed and then truly repented, repaired what they could, and humbled themselves. Islam is not naive, it recognizes human failure. But what Allah condemns is persistence. When someone continues harming others, justifying it, benefiting from it, and showing no intention of change, at that point, forgiveness without justice becomes a betrayal of the victim. Philosophically, oppression is a lie about reality. It assumes that power equals truth, that dominance equals rightness. Islam dismantles this illusion completely. In the Quran, the most powerful tyrants fall, and the most vulnerable believers rise. Why? Because moral weight, not force, determines value. When someone refuses to acknowledge that, they are not just wronging people, they are challenging divine order. This is why we are warned not to normalize oppression in the name of patience or peace. There is a difference between personal forgiveness and moral clarity. You may choose to forgive someone who wronged you, and that can be a noble act. but forgiving an unrepentant oppressor on behalf of others, or excusing systemic harm to maintain comfort, is not mercy, it is complicity. Islam never asks the oppressed to romanticize their suffering. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this warning. Oppression is not only about those people out there. It asks each of us to examine where we hold power, over our children, over our spouses, over employees, over those who depend on us emotionally or financially. Power reveals character, and the Quran is relentless in reminding us that every form of authority is a test, not a privilege. Allah delays the oppressor, but He does not neglect them. That delay is not approval, it is opportunity for repentance, reform, and restraint. But when that opportunity is wasted, justice does not disappear. It simply arrives on a different timeline. So the reflection to sit with is this: before demanding justice from the world, ask whether you are just in the spaces where no one can stop you. Because oppression doesn't begin with fists. It begins with a heart that forgot it will stand alone before Allah. After oppression, Allah draws our attention to something that often hides behind clever language and good intentions: corruption that spreads while pretending to fix things. The Quran speaks about those who cause fasad on the earth and then say, "We are only reformers." That sentence alone should make us uncomfortable because it captures a deeply human tendency to justify harm by dressing it up as progress. Corruption is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it wears a suit. Sometimes it speaks eloquently. Sometimes it uses religious, intellectual, or moral language. Psychologically, corruption thrives when a person disconnects consequences from responsibility. They convince themselves that the damage they cause is necessary, inevitable, or someone else's fault. Over time, this self-justification becomes so polished that they no longer recognize their actions as harmful at all. Allah's warning here is not against mistakes or failed attempts at improvement. Islam encourages reform, learning, and growth. The danger lies in persistent corruption, when someone is shown the harm they are causing and still refuses to stop, refuses to listen, refuses to correct themselves. When arrogance replaces humility, reform becomes impossible, and without humility, repentance is blocked. Philosophically, corruption is the manipulation of truth. It takes something pure, justice, freedom, reform, even religion, and uses it as a tool for ego, control, or gain. That is why Allah treats corruption so seriously, because once trust in truth collapses, society does not fall apart immediately. It rots slowly. People become cynical. They stop believing in sincerity. They assume everyone has an agenda, and when that happens, even genuine goodness struggles to survive. Islam teaches us that forgiveness is not a substitute for accountability. If someone spreads corruption and then offers empty apologies without change, forgiveness becomes meaningless. Mercy in Islam is not blind, it is wise. It looks for signs of reform, not performances of regret. The Quran consistently ties forgiveness to action, to stopping the harm, repairing what can be repaired, and committing to a different path. This warning also turns inward. Corruption is not only systemic or public. It can live quietly in personal spaces. When someone manipulates relationships, spreads toxicity, normalizes dishonesty, or poisons environments while claiming to be just being honest or keeping it real. These are the small forms of fasad that feel harmless but slowly erode trust and peace. Allah does not condemn people for falling. He condemns people for refusing to stand back up properly, and that distinction matters. Because a society can survive mistakes, what it cannot survive is arrogance that refuses correction. So perhaps the reflection to leave with is this: before claiming to fix the world, make sure you are not breaking it in subtler ways. Because corruption does not begin with destruction, it begins with a heart that refuses to admit it might be wrong. After corruption that damages societies, Allah warns us about a harm that can be even more far-reaching, leading people away from Him deliberately. This is not about someone who is confused, exploring ideas, or asking difficult questions. Islam does not fear questions. This warning is about those who knowingly misguide others, who use influence, knowledge, charisma, or authority to pull hearts away from truth for personal gain, ego, or control. The Quran is very clear that misguidance is not a light matter. When a person chooses a wrong path privately, the damage is contained. But when someone becomes a cause for others to lose faith, abandon values, or distort their relationship with Allah, the consequences multiply. Psychologically, this kind of person often doesn't see themselves as destructive. In fact, they may feel important, intelligent, even heroic. They enjoy being followed, they enjoy shaping thought, and slowly, influence replaces responsibility. Islam teaches us that influence is an amana, a trust. Every word you speak, every idea you normalize, every doubt you plant carries weight. That is why the Prophet warned that whoever calls to misguidance carries the burden of their own sins and the sins of those who followed them, without reducing the followers' accountability. Philosophically, this tells us something profound. Ideas are not neutral. They shape lives, and misused ideas can be more dangerous than physical harm. This warning is especially relevant in times where voices travel fast and authority is often self-assigned. A person may quote verses, use psychology, or speak confidently, yet quietly detach people from humility, worship, accountability, or moral restraint. Sometimes misguidance doesn't tell people to reject Allah outright. It simply convinces them that obedience is outdated, that truth is flexible, that sincerity is optional, and that subtle shift is often more damaging than open disbelief. Forgiveness here cannot be casual. When someone knowingly harms people's relationship with Allah and shows no remorse, no correction, no effort to undo the damage, forgiving them emotionally does not erase the harm spiritually. Islam never asks us to prioritize social comfort over eternal consequences. Mercy without truth becomes cruelty to those who are misled. And once again, this warning is not just outward. Every one of us teaches something, through words, behavior, or silence. Parents teach children. Friends teach friends, leaders teach followers. Even casual comments can normalize doubt, cynicism, or disregard for faith. That is why this point should humble us before it alarms us. Misguidance is not always a microphone and a crowd. Sometimes it is a careless sentence repeated often enough to shape belief. Allah's justice here is precise. He does not punish people for struggling. He does not condemn sincere seekers. He warns those who exploit others' trust while knowing better. Because to mislead a soul is not just to harm a person, it is to interfere with a journey back to Allah. So the reflection to walk away with is this: before asking who is influencing you, ask what you are influencing others toward. Because on the day we meet Allah, we will not only answer for the paths we chose, but for the paths we encouraged others to walk. After walking through all these warnings, it becomes essential to land the conversation in the right place. Because Islam is not a religion of bitterness, resentment, or emotional rigidity. At its core, it is a religion of mercy. But mercy in Islam is not shallow, and it is not reckless. It is principled. And this final point ties everything together. Forgiveness belongs to Allah, and justice belongs to truth. One of the biggest psychological confusions people struggle with is thinking that forgiveness means pretending harm did not happen, or that principles no longer matter. Islam never teaches that. You can forgive someone emotionally to free your own heart, while still refusing to excuse wrongdoing, normalize evil, or override divine warnings. These are two very different things. Forgiveness is an internal act. Justice is a moral stance. Allah is Al-Ghafur, the most forgiving, but He is also Al-Adl, the utterly just. Those two names are never in conflict. What confuses us is when we try to play Allah's role ourselves, when we forgive where Allah has set conditions, or condemn where Allah has left room for mercy. Islam brings balance back into that equation. It teaches us humility. You are not the final judge, but you are responsible for clarity. Philosophically, this matters because a society that confuses mercy with moral collapse eventually loses both. When everything is forgiven without accountability, truth becomes negotiable. When principles are bent for comfort, corruption gains ground. Islam protects us from that by tying forgiveness to repentance, change, and repair. Without those, forgiveness becomes emotional denial, not virtue. This final principle also protects your mental health. Many people carry guilt for not forgiving those who are unrepentant, abusive, or destructive. Islam lifts that burden. You are not required to emotionally absolve someone who continues to harm, deceive, or corrupt. What you are required to do is avoid injustice, avoid hatred, and avoid becoming like them. That is a very important distinction. At the same time, this principle turns the spotlight back onto us. If Allah's mercy is conditional upon repentance and sincerity, then the smartest spiritual strategy is not to argue about who deserves forgiveness, but to make sure we qualify for it ourselves. That means staying soft-hearted, self-aware, and willing to change when corrected. It means being more concerned with our standing before Allah than with winning moral arguments. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of all. Islam does not ask us to be naive, and it does not ask us to be cruel. It asks us to be honest, honest about harm, honest about responsibility, honest about the limits of human forgiveness and the perfection of divine justice. So the thought to leave with is this: protect your heart with forgiveness where it heals, protect your principles with truth where it matters, and protect your future by never forgetting that one day, all of us will stand before Allah with nothing but what we chose to uphold.